So do you know your DDs from your HDs when it comes to using floppy disks with your synthesizers? Yes, the workshop is a right mess at the moment. It's probably because I'm having chimney breast knocked out in the main house and a load of rubbish has had to come out here, and I'm still trying to find homes for it all. But that's not what the subject of this video is about. Now, if you watch the channel on a regular basis, you probably know that I own a number of legacy synthesizers. And these synthesizers recall patches or allow you to save patches to your computer using a funny thing. One of these things. A floppy disk. And right about now, a number of you are scanning the screen. Why not just put an emulator in those synthesizers and modules and be done with the floppy disk? But I do have a number of reasons why I keep the floppy disk in the instrument opposed to swapping out for a aforesaid emulator, which, to be honest, are far too long to list in this video at this point in time. But the question is, do you know why you should be using a DD or an HD in your synthesizer? Remember, like, comment, subscribe to the channel. Go over to Instagram and follow me there. Go over to Facebook, follow me there. That's where the normal notices are. And consider becoming a Patreon. So, as we all know, floppy disks have been around for a number of years. In various formats and guises, etc, etc. And to be honest, these have largely disappeared from modern computing. Our file sizes are just so big nowadays that trying to get something on one of these formatted at 1.44 megabytes or 720 megabytes or even 720 kilobytes or even 360 kilobytes is something that is a bit difficult. Now, if you own a synthesizer like a Yamaha SY77, which you would have seen recently in a series of videos I did, that synthesizer needed a 3.5 floppy disk as one of the mediums to transfer your patches on and off the synthesizer. That being a 3.5 inch floppy disk. Now, going back in history, floppy disks have shipped in all kinds of formats. I mean, when I first started my career, you know, the 8-inch drive was just sort of kind of disappearing off the scene. Pretty much it was the sort of 3 and 5.25. And those discs were used on keyboards like the EMU emulator. Though basically the disc was 5¼ inches long, and it was a flexible rather than a rigid cover. Then we had formats like the 2.8 inch quick disc, which were used on certain Akai synthesizers, or Akai samplers should I say, and things like the Roland S10 and MKS 100. They all used this quick disc format, as did the Amstrad CPC something or other, also used this quick disc format, 2.8 inches. Can you get hold of one of those nowadays? Not for love nor money. They are so difficult to get hold of. But if you had one of those instruments, you did need a 2.8 inch, unless of course you put an emulator in. And then we come on to the 3.5 inch disc. And for synthesizers of a certain age that used floppy disks, the 3.5 inch was probably the most accepted format that you would use on those particular machines. They were the machines of the late 80s, early 90s, and just like the SY77 that I had on the bench a few weeks ago. Now, from this point forward, I'm only going to talk about the 3.5 inch disc. Okay, the other formats are kind of irrelevant to this sort of conversation. But these discs, these hard copy 3.5 inch discs, came in a number of varieties. There was the single-sided double density, written down as SSDD, which was 360 kilobytes. Very few synthesizers used that format, but it still was used. Then you had the double-sided, double density, written down as DSDD, and they came in the 720 kilobytes flavour. Double the memory, sorry, double the storage, should I say, because effectively you weren't using just one side, you were using both sides of the disc. Didn't have to turn it over. Which reminds me, in the old days, the single-sided double density could actually, in a lot of instances, just be turned over. Definitely in the 5 1/4 inch bracket, you could do it in the 5 1/4. Not so much in these, but in the 5 1/4 you could. And then the kind of the last major incarnation. There were many other 3 1/2 inch formats that had a much more increased capacity, but you had this one, which is the double-sided high density or DSHD disc, and this could handle twice the amount of the previous disc, 1.44 megabytes, and this was used on synthesizers like the Korg T1. And something that's not explained very well when you start talking about these different varieties of discs is the fact that they actually had different magnetic media. So if you were to flip back the cover like so, and you were to look at the disc, right, that one is quite grey. If I look at this one, assuming I can open the, this is a broken disc, isn't it? Yeah, that's a broken disc. Let's try that one. Right, and I don't think it comes across on camera very well, but they are actually slightly different colours. This is a slightly lighter colour to this one, which is a darker colour. And as I say, I don't think that's going to come out on camera very well. But the difference in colour actually is a result of the different sort of magnetic media, how they got the magnetism onto the disc. And at the end of the day, what these are is effectively a disc, which is a plastic disc. If you ever took one of these pieces, you'll notice it's incredibly flexible because it's actually a plastic disc that is then coated with a magnetic media onto it that then forms the surface that you can read and write to, store your data. But the reason why you have different magnetic media is because the different magnetic media needs different properties from the disk drive to be able to read and write to the disk. And in a lot of instances, that's actually taken care of by the number of slots on a disk. So given the number of slots, when you put that disk into a disk drive, it knows how much electrical power to use to read and write to that disk. Now, you should have the correct disk for the synthesizer you're trying to work with. So if you've got an SY77, you should be using the double-sided double density disc, because it needed a 720 kilobyte disc. Now they're becoming harder and harder to get hold of. So why shouldn't I be using the high density disc with the second hole covered over to make the machine think that it is a 720 kilobyte disc, to try and fool it into being able to work in your machine? But the 720 discs are becoming rare and hard to find. So you know what? I can find these high density discs relatively much easier than I can find the lower ones. So why don't I just use one of these? Well, the truth is, you might get away with it. But I refer to the point I raised earlier about two different disk sizes using two different power levels to write information onto the disk. To write that data you're trying to save onto this thing, it requires a different amount of power. And the higher density disk, this one, requires more magnetism, more power than is required to write to this one, because you're trying to squeeze more data onto something the same size. Now I'm not going to go into really into the nuts and bolts of this, but the reality is a instrument that uses a 720 kilobyte disk might not, because the disk drive is quite old and would have been manufactured for a 720 kilobyte disk, might not have enough power to actually write to this disk. Even though you may think that you have sufficient oomph to magnetize the double-sided high-density disk, and you could maybe read it, you might find that your data becomes unrecoverable quite quickly because it hasn't been written properly. A lot of people say, yeah, but it does work. And quite often it will work immediately after you've written it. But quite often, once left in storage, you can't read it again. So if you're going to try and use a DS HD disk, then it's important you follow this procedure before you start trying to use it. First of all, format this disk first. So clean it, format it so it is a 1.4 megabyte PC disk. Okay, these things are capable of storing 2 megabytes, and you see in different formats that they are actually formatted in different ways. So for example, the Korg T1 formats these as 1.6 megabytes capacity. A PC will format them at 1.44, but they actually do have a capacity of 2 megabytes. Similarly, these have a capacity of 1 megabyte, but most machines will format them to 720 kilobytes. But if you're going to do that, format it. Make sure everything that's on this disk is first erased, and all the tracks are correctly formatted. That's what you want to do first. Then you format the disk as a double-sided double density to realign the tracks to the lower density structure that a double-sided double density disk has, instead of your high density double-sided high density disk. This, if you follow this process, you're more chance of actually making it work than if you just put the disk in and let the machine do it. Now, issue number 2. Can I write information from my corporate or my computer to my floppy? This is kind of a bit of a can of worms. And many early synth users used a proprietary filing system for the disk structure. So if you go and try and read an Ensoniq disk in your machine, your computer, it'll probably say not formatted, because it can't read anything other than a 720 or a 1.4 megabyte disk. And many of the other computers or synthesizers this area were very similar in this approach. They had weird formatting. Some of them opted for a standard 720 disk drive, and you could use that. Others had to be formatted into a FAT12 format, and a lot of PCs manufactured after the synths were made dropped the FAT12 format in favour of a FAT32 format. And because of that, and because of these different sizes, as I said, Korg T1 was 1.6 megabytes. The trying to think what other discs I've got. Roland samplers was 720, so you could get away with that. The Yamaha machines were slightly different. Ensoniq were different. The EMU drum, I can't think of, that was a different format as well. Lots of different formats. A lot of early computers use proprietary formats as well. So if you go and look at the Tandy or the Sinclair, or that could use discs, they were all different formats in terms of how they actually structured the disc. And therefore, if you quite often go and actually look at the disc on one of these machines, it'll just say, not formatted, do you want to format? Of course you're going to hit the no button. Because if you format it, guess what? You lose all your data. There are programs that have been written that allow these formats to be written from a PC or a Mac. Problem with that is time has gone on, and many of these programs have kind of fallen into complete disrepair. The authors no longer supported them. Quite a lot of these programs are written by, a software engineer who was trying to solve a problem and then saw kind of a market for it. And because of that, you ended up with, limited support, and the software engineer is retired or gone and done something less boring instead, or even maybe died. And support for that whole sort of software ecosystem has just basically died as well. There are a couple of programs still available, but in the main, it's getting far, far harder to support these older machines. I have a process I use, and I have a number of problems as well at the moment, in terms of I've got machines which I'm struggling to copy discs. Now I'm not copying discs for the sake of copying discs, but I have a policy that I never use the original. Why? Because I don't want to lose the data on the original. So what I do is I take a backup, I take an image of the original, and then I put the image onto a blank, and I use the blank. Because if I bugger it up, guess what? I can make another one. If I bugger the original up, I feel rather upset. And I have done that, which is why I had the policy in place, use a copy. Now, many of the chat rooms will quite often tell you, you can just use a formatted 720 KB disc in your Yamaha machine. And that may well be the case. What a lot of them fail to tell you, though, is that even though you formatted your disc in your legacy machine and you formatted it as a double density, double-sided 720 KB variety, it still may have problems being written to by your PC or Mac. This might have been once true. The ability to write to these machines, these discs, might have been once true on these platforms. But again, due to the march of technology and the newer computer, the facility has been removed, or it's been moved to a command line function, or whatever it happens to be. On a Windows XP machine, you cannot go into the Windows GUI and format a 720 kilobyte disk. You have to go into a command line and format a 720 kilobyte disk. And this becomes incredibly frustrating. I find it really frustrating myself, because people tell me, oh, you can just do this. And when I try it, it fails. And I can't work out what I'm doing wrong. I really can't. But the first thing that is omitted from the conversation, especially if you're looking at a PC style formatted disk, is they completely omit the term file allocation table, or in this case abbreviated to FAT. Back in the early days of computer disks, computers formatted, or floppy disks, computers formatted the floppy drive using a file allocation table size of 12 bits. So effectively 12 bits were being transferred through the mechanism onto the disk. This then moved to 16 bits and later to 32 bits, which became pretty much the standard on most portable computers for quite a period of time. If you looked at the disks in the formatting, or if you look specifically at the disk structure, what you quite often will see is it will refer to FAT12, FAT16, FAT32. I'm not sure you can get a FAT64, but by and large they're the three ones. And every PC that's been produced probably in the last 20 years has in the operating system only the ability to format a FAT32. Even if you go into the command line and try to format it as a FAT12, it will fail. The reason it will fail is because the disk drive in those machines is not so equipped to be able to format a FAT12 disk. That is just reality. And it's something that's really problematical, because an older synthesizer that is looking for a FAT12 format cannot read a FAT32 format. Even if your computer can read a FAT12 format, which many computers could read, but they can't write to them. If you try to write to a FAT32 format, you will get an error, and then typically the disk will then report that it is unformatted and you lose everything, or it comes back and says bad disk, disk unrecognisable, or disk error. If you put it into the machine after that, typically the instrument will read bad disk. As I said earlier on a Windows XP machine, you can't format a disk as a FAT12. In fact, you can't format a floppy disk on a XP machine as a 720 kilobyte disk. You have to do this through the command line, and by default, even if you do it by the command line, if you format a 720 kilobyte disk in the command line, it will still format it as FAT32. And the command you have to write, which will appear on the screen somewhere, is a://fs equals FAT /t equals 80 n/n:90. However, if your machine can't read the command to format a basic FAT disk, it will fail. So, what do you need to do? Well, you might have to go and buy a machine with an older operating system on that still supports the old FAT formatting. And even then, you might be unlucky because the hardware may have moved on and the disk drive won't support it. It's such a bunch of pitfalls that you wouldn't believe how much hair I've lost trying to make things work. And here's another thing to consider. Modern PCs do not have floppy disk drives anymore. If you want to read or write to a floppy disk drive, you've got to go and buy a USB floppy disk drive that plugs into one of your USB ports. And beware, people, computers are now starting to drop the old A-style USB ports in favour of the C-style USB ports. Why? Because C is more versatile, it's faster. It does all these things that everybody loves, go faster, go quicker, go better. But you can't use a USB floppy disk drive. And the reason why? Because a USB style floppy disk drive is designed to work with a 1.4 double-sided high density disk. It can't work with a 720, or it can't format a 720 kilobyte disk. It can't write to a 720 kilobyte disk because it is not set up to run with them. And even if you did manage to get it to read and write, or you had your USB drive, you can't use any of these specialist programs to interrogate the disk to create more copies of the disk, because the whole syntax for using the USB is completely different to using an internally supported floppy disk drive. Oh, don't you wish? Don't you just wish? But it's not just us musicians that need one of these things and need to be able to transfer data in an old format. Do you know that most Boeing 747s still needed 3.5-inch floppies? So there was a whole market for these things still knocking around, because this is how you updated the flight computer on a Boeing 747. The military still uses floppy disks. If you think the longevity of pieces of military equipment, these things were designed when floppy disks were the medium of choice for transferring data. Not this USB stuff, not this connected hard drive stuff. No, you did it with this. Many specialist production facilities. And I'm thinking of things that using, cutting turrets and that sort of stuff. CNC machines. You don't throw away these machines. They are worth hundreds of thousands, if not millions, to the company that's bought them. They've been bought for certain reasons, for for making certain things. And you don't reinvest in that technology overnight just because the computer manufacturers say you shouldn't be doing that anymore. So there's still a market for these discs. It's just a shame that all the other industries that rely on these things, the computer industry has kind of turned its back on it. And because the computer industry has turned its back on it, manufacturers are not making these in the numbers that they used to do. And that's fair enough. You can still get hold of brand new double-sided high density discs. But the supply of these, the double-sided double density discs, is becoming very difficult indeed. And it's about time somebody bit the bullet and hopefully made these, because there is still a market for these discs. It's a shame that somebody just hasn't cottoned onto it. And on that note, I'm going to leave you and say, live long and prosper, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.